Hello everybody and welcome to part 11 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues. We start in space with our probe that's going to Jool, our sister probe to the Larunda that went to Moho. I'm going to have to give this one a name at some point. As I mentioned in a previous episode, we sort of set the precedent with the Larunda, but well, we'll sort that out later. The probe is still about 250 days away from its encounter with Jool, but that's sort of the ideal opportunity, just to go there, make sure everything's working as intended, and see if we need to perform any correction burns. Now, our approach is pretty good. We're going the right way round Jool, which is a start, but our periapsis, our closest approach, is a little far out. Now, this shouldn't be too much of a problem in the broader scheme of things. We can just get in there, we can just start to burn the orbit down once we've actually captured, but well, it's a bit more fuel efficient to get our periapsis down a bit closer and then perform our manoeuvres from there. And unlike the Larunda probe, fuel efficiency is a little bit more important with this mission. So we start with planning our manoeuvre. I'm not actually going to use the manoeuvre node, the planned manoeuvre. I'm just going to use that to sort of get the gist of things, and then we're just going to burn in that direction until our periapsis is down to something a little more ideal. Now, Jool is a big planet with a massive sphere of influence, as our initial apoapsis of 677,000 kilometres should tell us. So to start with, I thought I'd aim for about 20,000 kilometres. I mean, for most planets that would be ridiculously far out, but for Jool, not quite so much. So I start to make our burn, bringing our apoapsis down a bit, but at around about the 40 to 45,000 kilometre mark, something strange happens. Our little path indicator, our encounter indicator, suddenly shifts off to where Jool currently is rather than where it will be. It takes me a little while to work out what's happening here, but that's because we're actually picking up an encounter with Tylo. Now, this gives me a little bit of pause for thought, because if we're hitting one of Jool's moons that high up, maybe 20,000 kilometres is a little bit low, but I decide to persevere with it. We continue our burn, we overshoot a little bit, and because this probe doesn't have any RCS thrusters for fine-tuning, we have to sort of flip it round, burn the other way, we overshoot it a little bit the other way, so turn it back round. Eventually, though, we do get it down to our desired 20,000 kilometre mark. I mean, with hindsight, I probably should have just left it where it was before those correction manoeuvres. I mean, 20,000 kilometres was entirely arbitrary, but I'd kind of decided on a 20,000 kilometre periapsis, and then the OCD sort of kicked in, so there we go. But not to worry too much. I mean, the amount of fuel we used in those correction manoeuvres was absolutely negligible, so it doesn't impact us really in any way. Anyway, with all that done, we are set for our rendezvous with Jool, as I said, in about 250 days. But in the meantime, we've got a couple of things to take care of a little bit closer to home. To start with then, we head to the R&D centre, where we've got 4,000 science points to spend, and we're going to start filling out a bit more of that 9th tier of the tech tree. Now, as I've previously mentioned, before this series is out, I'd like to land Kerbals on Moho, I'd like to land Kerbals on Eve, and of course get them back safely, but we're not going to be able to do that with our current generation of vehicles. We need a next generation, so to that end, we need to start picking up the techs that will make that possible. So we pick up the propulsion tech, some fuel tech, some construction tech, and most pertinently to this episode, we also pick up the next node of aerotech. There are a couple of other nodes I would have liked to have picked up, but well, we'll just have to wait for those. We'll have to wait until the science trickles in from our orbital research station. But I'm quite pleased with the haul from today, and now I suppose it's time to take what we've learned and see if we can build something that's really going to push our space program forwards. So if we're going to design a new generation of vehicles, what better place to start than with the vehicles that are actually going to get stuff into orbit? So this is an early attempt at an SSTO, a single stage to orbit craft. I haven't really done space planes in my own saves. I'm normally sort of a stick it on a rocket and get it up there kind of guy, but I thought for this series, for this channel, I really ought to start dabbling in them. So this is pretty much my first attempt at a space plane. Ultimately, what I'm trying to design here is a replacement for my Mark II shuttle. I've got 3 variants of Mark II shuttle, each of which specialises in a different role, and I'd like to roll all of that into one vehicle. I'd like to have one vehicle that can do any of the jobs just as well as the relevantly specialised variant of the Mark II shuttle currently can. So the craft here has all of the mission capability that I'm looking for, but does it have the same getting to space capability? Well, there's only one way to find out. So we fire up those engines, we take off from the runway. Now the research I've done seems to suggest, first of all, that for any particular space plane that you create, the optimal ascent profile is pretty much a process of trial and error. And so this is our first trial, and I completely expect it to be our first error as well. I don't have much hope out for this first run. Also, in the research, it seems to suggest that most space planes ascend with a nose-up angle of somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees. I decide what I'm going to do for this run is put the nose at about 20 degrees and just go for it. Open the throttles up all the way and see what happens. Now, entirely typically for a KSP spaceplane, I'm using these Rapier engines that we've just unlocked. Now, the Rapier engines are a Jool mode engines. You can use them like rockets, just pump in fuel and oxidizer, and they behave in pretty much the same way. But most importantly, they also have an air-breathing mode, so they can behave like ordinary jet engines. So when you're low down in the atmosphere, you can use the jet engine mode, and it's vastly more fuel efficient. And the idea is you use that to do as much of the heavy lifting as is possible, and when you get up so high that it's just not feasible to use jets anymore, you kick in the rocket mode, and that takes you the rest of the way into space. So with this first run, we get ourselves an apoapsis of 75,000 metres, so good news, we are going to space today, which is a start, but we have got nowhere near enough delta V to actually circularise our orbit. By the time we get to our apoapsis, we are going to need roughly 300 metres per second to circularise, and we've got less than 100. Once we get to apoapsis, I do burn off the remainder of that delta V. I'm just curious to see how far I can get with this thing, but I think one thing is very clear, and that's that this vehicle, in its current form, isn't the vehicle for us. We need a vehicle that can get to space, circularise its orbit, and then, as a bare minimum, get to the space station and back. And that's not to mention the stuff that the Mark II shuttles could do, such as service probes and interplanetary craft that are parked about 500,000 metres out from Kerbin. And no matter how much we optimise our ascent profile, we're just not going to squeeze that much delta V out of this thing. So as a first run, this was very educational, but it's back to the drawing board from here. So if in doubt, add more fuel. It's early the next morning, our Kerbals have been up all night tinkering, and this is what they've come up with. It's basically the same craft, only with an extra fuel tank section in the fuselage and both of those engine nacelles. Greyfried Kerman is back in command for this one. Last time she took up Erison Kerman, this time it's Jeblov Kerman's turn. So without any further ado, let's get this show on the road. We fire up those Rapier engines and take off from the runway. Now, it's worth pointing out that those Rapier engines in air-breathing mode don't behave like conventional jet engines. They behave more like ramjets, not quite as efficient as the dedicated ramjet, that's the Whiplash in stock KSP, but pretty good for our purposes. Now, in real life, a proper ramjet has to be going quite far past the speed of sound before you can actually really use it, but in KSP, it just models that by becoming more efficient the faster you go. It's significantly more efficient, a little way past the speed of sound, and just keeps getting more and more efficient from there. Now, for this run, I am trying a slightly different approach to the ascent. I'm trying to get those engines in their air-breathing mode to do as much of the work as is possible, and we get the craft going up to a little over 1,400 metres per second before we kick in with the rocket mode, and from there we boost our apoapsis up to about 75,000 metres. Whether because of the design, the ascent, or perhaps a combination of the two, things go much better this time. We arrive in space with 792 metres per second of delta V, which is more than enough to circularise our orbit. Having circularised, though, we only have 438 to spare, and that's not a lot. It might be enough to get us to the space station and back, perhaps if we throw an aerobraking manoeuvre in there, but no, it's less than we need, so we're going to go and try that again, but first we need to get this craft home. Because we've circularised the orbit, we do have the luxury of being able to choose a landing site to aim for. I'm doing a little bit of an experiment with this descent. I sort of intend to overshoot, but we perform our deorbit burn, we re-enter the atmosphere, and we approach the KSC. We do overshoot, as I kind of had planned, but then our craft has more than enough fuel to turn around, just use air-breathing jet mode to get us back to the KSC, and we make a safe landing on the runway. So we're going to go for one more run with the same craft. I say one more run. I've done a ton of these that I haven't recorded, but this is the one where I'm going to take everything I've learned so far, put it into the one ascent, and see what we can really squeeze out of this thing. Greyfrid and Jeblorf return to their seats because I forgot to swap Jeblorf out for Erison. And we are going to get this thing going. We fire up those Rapier engines, we take off from the runway, let's see what this thing can do. For the initial part of the ascent, we want to get to 10,000 metres. We're not going full throttle or anything like that. We're not in a particular hurry to get there. We just want to get there and get there pretty efficiently. Once we get to 10,000 metres, I drop the nose and I open the throttles up all the way. This is just to get us going fast enough that those ramjet engines really start to kick in. As our speed approaches 1,000 metres per second, I lift the nose up to 20 degrees above the horizon, and that's where I'm going to keep it as we try to accrue as much horizontal and vertical velocity as we possibly can before those air-breathing engines start to fade. That happens at about 23,000 metres, so we engage the rocket mode on those Rapier engines, and we push our apoapsis up to about 85,000 metres. Now this is a much more efficient run. We get into space with 875 metres per second of delta V. If I'd aimed for a 75,000 metre apoapsis as I did in those last two runs, that figure would be even higher. With that higher apoapsis, our circularization manoeuvre is a little bit more costly in terms of delta V than it would be had I gone for the same altitude as the last two runs. We end up with 444 metres per second. Only 6 metres per second more than our previous run, but we are in an orbit 10,000 metres higher. Once again, we might be able to reach the space station from here, but I'm not in the mood to risk it. What I am going to do is perform a little test manoeuvre. We're going to boost our apoapsis up to about 200,000 metres, travel around the planet, and then recircularize. With all our spaceplane testing for the day done then, it's time for us to head to home. This time I am going to try and hit the KSC as squarely as I can, so we perform our deorbit burn and make our way into the atmosphere. It does look like we might be coming up a little short, so I dip the nose and that takes care of that, and before too long we are once again touching down on the KSC runway. So it's been an interesting few runs, it's been an interesting development process, but we're not there yet. I think we've got a good platform to build on, but it's going to require a bit more work. Hopefully in a future episode before too long I will be able to show you the finished article of all that. But we're not quite done for today. In fact, we're going to finish today's episode pretty much as we started it. So we return to our Jool probe as it gets ever further and further from Kerbal, that sunlight barely registering on its solar panels by now. Now we really don't have anything to do until the Jool probe reaches Jool and the Ptolemy reaches Juno, which is going to happen at almost exactly the same time. So yeah, that's going to be kind of busy for us, so I want to get this lead up to it out of the way now. So we follow our probe in until it gets its encounter. Just in the top left here on the map view, you can see the icons for Juno and the Ptolemy getting very close indeed. But anyway, our probe has reached its encounter. You can just about make out Jool here. It's a tiny green spot, roughly above the probe's communications dish. If you're watching this on mobile, the very best of luck to you. But that is where we're going to leave things for today. It's been a slightly shorter one than usual today, my apologies for that, but we are just about to move house, so that is taking up a hell of a lot of my time. In fact, we just got the keys today. If you're watching this just as it comes out, then I am currently stripping wallpaper, so I guarantee you, even if you do not like this video, you're still having more fun than I am at the moment. I'm not quite sure what our next episode is going to be. We're going to have to follow this probing, get its orbit circularized, and then switch to the Ptolemy, do likewise with that around Juno. And then I'll probably decide what the focus will be as I'm playing through it. But for now, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.